folks, welcome back for another Feature Friday. I'm your host Ryan Glover, and this week we're going to be learning how to sort and filter a list. So this is something that's pretty simple in terms of the parts involved. It's not like it's a highly technical feature to add to your product, but it is common enough that it warrants some attention. And in particular, when we're working with tools like Pup, and more specifically Apollo. So Apollo is the client-side tool that we use inside of Pup to make requests to GraphQL. It may not be immediately clear how exactly you do filtering and sorting using that tool. So what we're going to look at today is filtering and sorting lists inside of the roadmap feature in Clever Beagle's upcoming Sass command. To get started, what I want to do is take a look at what exactly it is we're going to be building. So this UI should look relatively familiar if you've been watching the last few Feature Fridays. This is the cards UI inside of Command, but what I'm currently focused on is the roadmap feature. So this is going to allow you to organize your cards into different versions. And what I want to do today is focus on wiring up the sort of this list. So right now this isn't working. I've just got the UI component here. But ideally what's going to happen is when we change from newest first to oldest first, this list down below is going to sort based on the version. So each release inside of your roadmap is given a version number, and we want to see that sort order flip-flop based on which item we've got selected in the drop-down here. Jumping over to the code, the first thing we want to look at here is this form.select component, and this component is coming from the UI kit I'm currently working on for Clever Beagle called Fur. So this isn't publicly available yet. I'm just kind of developing it as I develop command, and I get a 2-for-1. But just know that the form component from that library is going to export a form.select component. So this is the drop down that we see here. And what we want to do with that component, you'll notice that I'm not really controlling it in any way right now. So I'm not in control of the value of it. So what we want to do is convert this to a controlled component, which means adding access to a state value that we assign back to the select. And that may sound kind of confusing, so let's take a look. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a value prop to the form select component, and this is going to be assigned to this.state.sort order. Now this value doesn't exist, so what we're going to need to do is jump back up to the default state value on the product roadmap component. And just to be clear, that's this entire component that's rendered on screen right now. So that's the drop down, the versions themselves, the new version button, and this little bin where you'll be able to find all of your cards to kind of move around and drag and drop. So back here in the state, what we want to do is we want to create that value. So I'm going to space this code out a little bit, thinking ahead, because usually the linter likes to bicker with you. What did I call it? So I called it sort order. So we're just going to set this to sort order. And by default, what do I have this at? I've got this at newest first. I'm going to give this a refresh just to double check that. Yeah, newest first. So whatever your most recent version was, it's going to be on top. So let's keep that as the default. And so what I'm going to do is say newest first. And the reason I've chosen that value as the default value for this.state.sort order is if we go back down to the component and take a look, newest first is first in the list. So we want to match that as the default value. Now, where this is going to get interesting in a little bit is when we have to load up the existing data, but we'll take a look at that. So for now, we'll just say, okay, give us whatever the default value is on state and pass it as the value prop. Now, the second part of this to make this actually controlled is we have to have an on-change event on the select. So we need to know, okay, what happens when we flip between these two values? And so what we're going to do is add an on-change prop to the form select component, so same exact place. But now what we're going to do is point this to a function we need to write. So we're going to say, we'll say handle set sort order. So we've got this.handle set sort order. So the this is referring to this entire component. And so you can see I've already got quite a few handler functions here for managing state. So I'm just going to go ahead and pop this on the bottom here. Maybe I'll move this later. So we'll say handle set sort order equals. And you'll notice I'm doing this using an arrow function. So inside of a class, when you're working with React, you need to remember that there's the concept of this, where this is referring to the component instance. And in certain situations, you're going to need access to that component instance. So you may have seen something like this in the past where you'll have some method name, where a method name is something like handle open new release modal, and then you'll say this dot method name dot bind and then this to assign the component instance back to that function. Technically, now we don't need to do that. So that's the magic of modern JavaScript and using tools like Babel to compile your JavaScript into ES5 JavaScript, is that you don't have to worry about using new technology. So this syntax here, so this is a class property function. What we're doing here is we're saying assign this to an arrow function, and just by their very nature, arrow functions in JavaScript kick their this value back up to the parent. So meaning when I define this in this exact way, if I say this inside of this component, I'm referring to the entire component instance and not just this function by itself. So if I convert that back and I did something like this, now this is only referring to this function. It has no concept of its parent context or the parent component that's a part of. So what we're going to do is use that arrow function. The reason we need to do that is because we have to say this.setState. And setState is a function that's defined on that parent component instance. So we need to be able to say this.setState, and this is going to be sort order, and we need to set this to the value that was selected. So the way we're going to get that is if we look again, we're saying onChange call to this function. And we're not wrapping it in another function or anything like that. So what that means is when this form select gets changed, we're going to be past the actual onChange event from the DOM to handle set sort order. So what I'm going to expect up here is event, and just from years of working with JavaScript, what we know is that we can say event.target, and that's going to refer to the select component that's actually rendered on screen, so literally this drop down, and then we're going to say event.target.value. So that's going to refer to whatever the currently selected value is in this drop down. So in this case, I'm saying oldest first, so as soon as we make that change, that's firing the onChange event, and then by the time we get to this code to set the sort order onto state, what we're saying is event.target.value, so whatever the current value is. So immediately after it's changed, grab the new value, pop that onto state. And what that's going to do, so handle set order here being handled by onChange, so we're passing that to onChange. What's going to happen is we're creating a controlled component in React, which means that we're fully in control of the value that's rendered for this select component. So we're saying when it changes, put it onto state, and then whatever we pass as the value is what it should be displaying on screen. So we're controlling that entire cycle of events. And so now, if we go ahead and save this, nothing should really change here in terms of the UI. But if it works, meaning we see the values change in the dropdown, that's great because that means that we're now controlling it with our state value as opposed to it being uncontrolled, meaning it's just whatever's set in the DOM. So if we go back to roadmap now, we change this, great. So we've still got our value set. And just to make sure this is clear, if I pop open my inspector, not Redux, we want React. So I'm going to try and show you here. So if we just kind of pick a random thing, and we're looking for the product roadmap component. And we can see down here, I've got state of the product roadmap component. And remember, that's all of this stuff. We can see that blue box kind of drawn around it. So we've got sort order on state set to newest first, which matches what's in our dropdown. Now if we change it, boom, we can see it going to oldest first. So now we know for a fact, okay, we control this component, we control its value. Now it's great that we've got control over this component, so this select box here, and again, our dropdown. It's great that we have control over that, but we have to solve another problem before we can actually make this work. And so inside of the same exact component down at the bottom, I'm using the GraphQL higher order component to actually load the data into this component. And that higher order component takes in a query, a GraphQL query, as its first argument along with some options, and then it passes the result of running that query back down to the product roadmap component as props. And so if we look back up near the top here, we get a data prop from Apollo, or from that GraphQL higher order component, that's going to tell us, okay, is the data currently loading? And if it's not, what are the versions that we pulled back? And so if we look down here, we're looking at the versions query, which is just a variable in this file, and that's because I'm importing the actual query itself from another file. So inside of PUP, the way that all of your client-side GraphQL queries, mutations, and subscriptions are written is through .gql files. So this is inside of the UI directory here inside of PUP. So this is UI, and then we're going to go down to queries, and we want to look at versions.gql. And so in this case, we can see that we have our versions query, and it's obviously working because we're getting data back, but what we don't have is support for our sort filter. So right now I'm saying take this product ID and find all the versions for it, but I'm not exactly telling GraphQL, hey, we might change the sort order of those versions. So what we need to do is update this to support that default sort version. So what I'm going to do is add that now. So the way that your queries work in GraphQL is that you have an outer wrapper where you can pass in your variable names, and then you pass those variables along to the actual field that you're querying. So in this case, I'm going to say sort order, and we know that we're passing this as a string, so either newest first or oldest first. So I'm going to say this is a string, and I'm not going to add the exclamation point, so I'm not going to make it required in this case. Mostly for flexibility, but also just for sanity while we develop this. So we're going to say sort order is equal to sort order. So this is us just passing the variable along to the actual field. So that's part one. But then part two is over in the API. I've got the versions field that we're querying here, but again, remember that GraphQL is very, very picky. So even though that we've defined this on the client side, so we've got sort order here, we need to explicitly state that in our GraphQL schema as well. And so here the schema inside of PUP is where we load all of the different data that we have access to, and we define all of our GraphQL types, our query, our mutations, and then we also have our resolver. So we point to the functions that handle or resolve all of our queries and mutations. And so for versions, what we're going to do is come in here, we're going to say sort order is a variable that we expect, or an argument that we expect from the client, and we expect that because we just defined it back here in our client-side query. And so what we want to do is the exact same thing we did on the client. So we know this is going to be a string, and now what this is enabling for us is inside of our versions query. So this is the resolver function. So in GraphQL you have a field that you define, and that says, or not that one, we want this one. So it defines the name of the field that you can query, the arguments that are supported, and then the return value for that query. But to actually handle the query and resolve it, that's kind of where that word comes in, you have to write a resolver function. So that function is responsible for actually talking to your data source, and that could be a database, that could be another API like a third-party API, literally anything. GraphQL doesn't care, but that function is responsible for resolving the query. And so if we look inside, we can see that I'm already doing versions.find. So I'm using MongoDB, the stock database that's inside of PUP. So I'm saying in the versions collection in MongoDB, find all of the versions where this is the product ID. So that's great, and we know that's working. But we'll notice over here, I've just hard-coded the sort to -1, or literally newest first by default. And this is all well and good, but remember, we want to support flipping in the UI back over here. We want to be able to change this and have it actually update and rerun the query. So what we need to do right here is we'll notice on our resolver function we get an args argument. And that can be kind of confusing, but that's actually how it's kind of explained in the spec and all the documentation. So send your hate mail to Facebook. So we've got our args object, and on that object we're going to have all of the arguments we pass. So in this case, args.sortOrder is going to exist. Now we're a little bit weird in this case because we're not using the MongoDB friendly syntax of -1 or 1 to say which sort order do we want. So we're going to have to add a little bit of a ternary here. So we're going to say if the sort order equals newest first, jump back over here. So if it equals newest first, so question mark meaning if this is true, do this. So we do want to return -1. Otherwise, or else, we just want to return 1. So the idea here is that if args.sortOrder equals newest first, and remember that's the value that's returned when we're selecting newest first in the dropdown, we want to return -1 to say sort with literally newest first. So it's going to go from descending down. It's going to say, okay, highest possible value first, down to the lowest possible value. And then we're going to do the inverse if the sort order is not set to newest first. So if we go back and we set this to oldest first, we want our query to rerun setting the sort order to 1 or ascending, meaning going from the lowest to the highest. So this is all well and good, and just to be a good little developer, I'm going to clean up our syntax here for our linter. And there we go. That one wasn't too bad. Usually the prettier linting rules will drive you up a wall. So let's go ahead and save that. And now at this point, we should have everything that we need on the server side here. So server side meaning in our GraphQL schema. And we also have our query on the client. So all of that wiring is done, but now what we have to do is actually make this work in the UI or in relation to the queries that we're running from our UI. So we've got a little bit of a pickle here in order to get this working. So what we need to remember is that earlier what we did is we put sort order as a default onto state. And this is all well and good, but if we remember back down at the bottom here, we have this GraphQL higher order component that's running our versions query, but we'll notice that to the variables we're passing, we don't tell it about the sort order yet. And so if we go back to the query that we're running here, we can see that we added sort order and we wired it all up through the API here. So we've got it here, and then we've also got it recognized inside of our actual resolver for the query, but we don't tell our client side about it yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to add sort order as a variable here, and I'm going to hard code this by default. I'm going to set it to newest first, and the reason I'm putting newest first there is that if we look back up in our state, that's what we're setting our default to here. So we want those to match, so that way whatever's returned from our query matches what's selected in our UI. It would be kind of confusing if we had oldest first in the dropdown, but we were getting stuff sorted by newest first. So this is going to make sure that those two are in sync. So that's step one. And what we're going to do is go back to the client here and take a look. And this should refresh here. There we go. So if we jump back to the roadmap now, we can see that this is working. So this doesn't work. I've still got to do that part, but at least the very thing is we've got newest first here, and we've got 140, 130, 123. So we know it is sorting from newest first down. But the tricky part here is that we have to think like, well, okay, we're telling it by default, but the problem is how do we actually rerun this query, or how do we do a change to the query after it's already been run? And the answer is the refetch method that we get from Apollo. And so where we're going to use that is inside of our handle set sort order method, because remember, that's what's telling us, okay, we've changed to a new sort order. We want to change to a new sort order. So what I'm going to do is add a callback function here, and this callback function is built into the set state method from React. So this isn't something that we have to add ourselves. This is just a built-in piece of functionality. And what this does is it says, as soon as React has guaranteed that it has set state or has changed our state, it's going to call this callback function, and inside of that callback function we can do whatever we want. So that can just be any code. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to refetch our data. And so what we're going to say is we're going to do this.props.data.refetch. And so the refetch method does exactly what we think it does, which is it fires a refetch of the query where this data prop is coming from. Now let's rewind a little bit, because that may not make any sense. So remember, down here we're saying run the versions query by default. So when this component first loads on screen, run the versions query. And we want to run it with these variables. Great. So as part of doing that, what's happening is Apollo, or more importantly the GraphQL higher order component, is passing all of the results of running that query down as props to product roadmap. And the prop that it's giving us access to is this data prop. And so that data prop not only contains the data that was fetched, but it also has helper methods like refetch. And so what this allows us to do is refetch data whenever we want to. But what's neat is because it's powered by that data prop, it's rerunning the query or refetching the query that we've already assigned down here, which is pretty cool. So what we're going to do is refetch the data, and we can pass our options again, and in this case I'm going to pass variables, and we're going to say product ID is this.props.product ID, and then we're going to say sort order is equal to, and there's two ways for me to do this. So the dumb obvious one is this.state.sort order, and the reason I say that is because we're doing this in the callback of set state, we can guarantee that this state sort order is the newest value. It's the one that we just changed to. But you may have the inclination to say, well, why don't we just reuse event target value? And we can, but there's a gotcha. So in React, the event from the DOM, so this is known as a synthetic event because you're dealing with the virtual DOM inside of React. So that synthetic event only lasts or only exists inside of the parent context where it was passed. So what that means is inside of this callback function, we lose access to that event. It goes away. And so if we were going to use event target value down here, what we would have to do is add event.persist right here, which we can see adds some code to our UI. Sometimes that makes sense to do. In this case, we don't really have to do it, but it's good to know about. So if you ever find yourself trying to reuse the synthetic or event or the DOM event from some handler function, so in this case, the onChange event. So if you ever find yourself in that situation where you need that event, this is how you get it. So you have to say event.persist, and then inside of the callback where you reference it again, then you'll have access to it. So again, that's just a pro tip to throw out there, but for now we're just going to rely on this state sort order because we know it works. And so we're going to go and save this, and we're going to try and run it and see what happens. Hopefully it's all just working the way we expect. So if we go back here, go to roadmap, so we do get newest first by default, which is good. Now if we flip to oldest first, it doesn't work. Uh-oh. So we got to figure out what's going on. So let's open up our console, make sure we don't have any obvious errors. So I'm going to clear this. So we got oldest first. Okay, it's not working. And I have a feeling I know why. So if we jump back over to the code here, yeah, I think it's because this refetch method doesn't support variables like that. So we just pass this object as the variables that we want to switch to, and then it should work for us. So let's let this refresh and do its little doodle behind the scenes. And then we should be in business here. I don't have any syntax errors or nothing. No, let's give it a manual refresh. So if we go back now, and we flip to oldest first, there we go. Alright, so let's close that so we can see everything. So if I go to newest first, we get the newest on top. Go to oldest first, we get the oldest on top. So great. Good stuff. It worked. Okay, only one little hiccup. Not bad. Not bad. Yeah, usually it's a lot more as a developer. That is going to do it. That is adding a sort order. Now, like I said, this was pretty simple, but it may not have been immediately obvious how to do this, so it's always good to run through these simple things again and again just to see, how they work, and also give me a chance to get this built, because I've been kind of ignoring this feature inside of command here, so I'm glad that I got a chance to get this done, and also got a chance to teach you folks some stuff. So with that is going to do it for this week's Feature Friday. Like I always say before I let you go, make sure that you hit the subscribe button on our channel. That way you're going to get these as soon as they're published, but also hit the bell so that way you get the notification as soon as they're published. So if you're really eager to watch these as soon as they're released, click that bell and you're going to get them. So that is going to do it for me, and so signing off for the HMS Beagle. See you next week, folks. You just listened to me run my mouth for the better part of an hour about a bunch of really technical code. So why not commemorate that experience by watching another tutorial and having an absolute psychological meltdown?